Hello, my passion fruits. Welcome back to Music Corner. This is the recap, the show we do every 2 months where we talk about all of the new releases in music that you should hear about, that you should know about. Last time we did this 2 months ago, it was the beginning of the year. Things started off kind of slow, in my opinion, but this time around we have a lot more notable releases and, favorably, a lot more good releases to talk about. Why was my mic so quiet? We've also got a lot of releases to talk about this time around. So without wasting any time, we're going to start with some of the stuff I was disappointed by. Then we're going to get into some of the biggest, most popular releases. And then we're going to talk about the best stuff. For me, it's pretty easy to pick out the biggest disappointment of the last 2 months, even though I have never been a big Miley Cyrus fan. I think that Flowers is a pretty good single. I thought that it led off this album era really well. I'm very comfortable with it being the biggest hit of the year so far. I think it's a halfway decent song and one that actually kind of had me excited for this record. But when push comes to shove, this album is exactly as inconsistent, poorly thought out, and mediocre as almost all of Miley's stuff. And at this point, I don't really know why I would expect anything else. I really wanted this to be her best project ever, full of inescapable summer bops, but the fact that none of the other songs are really catching on here is proof enough that they're just not that good. Once again, not that I had the highest hopes for this Ray Srimmerd album. I liked their Ray Srimmerd 3 project, at least the part of it that was both of them working together, and I was just kind of hoping that they would build on some of the things that they hit on there and kind of let loose the shackles of trying to be such highly commercial artists and maybe hit on something really interesting. They do that occasionally on this album, but for the most part, it is just really forgettable, really, really boring, attempts at flavorful trap music. And that's actually it in terms of the disappointments, which means that the hater compilation for this episode that shows up on TikTok will probably be a lot shorter than the last one. Though we are certainly not done hating, as we're going to talk about some of the most popular releases of the year thus far across the last 2 months, starting with the new Gorillaz album, which isn't great. I think it led off with a great single in the title track, Cracker Island, and I was starting to come around to the second single, New Gold, but ultimately the whole thing is just a mixed bag. I think I like it more than Gorillaz haters do. I don't think it's a bad record. I think it's just a merely okay album. But like some of their records and outings in the mid-2000s post-Plastic Beach but before Song Machine, I feel like this has very little personality, very little that distinguishes this as a Gorillaz project, and that's why it suffers the most. Covered this new Shame project, UK post-punk outfit, and while yes, I think this is a solid record that post-punk fans will want to hear, I was really expecting this band to take a step forward like they did from their first album to their second album, and I thought that if they did that, they could release a really, really good record that was on the same level as some of their post-punky peers like Black Country New Road or Black Midi or Squid, but ultimately I think this was, if anything, a slight step back. It's still a fine record and it still has its highlights, but almost nothing on here is as exciting as some of the most riveting moments from their previous project, Drunk Tank Pink. The new Kali Uchis record I thought was solid. It dropped with not nearly as much fanfare as I was anticipating. I really thought that this thing would perform better than it did, its both singles and album sales, and that it might be, talked about and chewed through online a little bit more, but ultimately I get why. It's not the flashiest record in the world. It is extremely familiar by Kali Uchis standards, but there are certainly songs in the track list, great tracks like Moonlight and Endlessly, that are just as catchy, just as memorable as great Kali songs and hits in the past like Telepatia or almost anything from her debut. This is a record that I can actually say may not be getting the attention it deserves, and I think with a number of people being pretty big Kali Uchis fans out there, if this thing sits on the shelf for long enough, there will emerge a group of people who support it. The new Slow Tie record is one that has really divided people. Anthony Fantano over at the Needle Drop seems to really like it. I saw Mark from Spectrum Pulse do a pretty scathing review of it. He did not really seem to like it, and I come down somewhere in the middle. I admire Slowthai for taking a lot of bold artistic risks on this thing. However, not all of them pay off, and when they do pay off on tracks like Yum, the opener, and Tourniquet, it can be really thrilling and really engaging in a way that Slowthai has never really been before. But there are also just some huge whiffs on this record, some moments that I would consider extremely embarrassing in the wrong kind of way for Slowthai, and the result is just an all-over-the-place album. Back in March, M83 returned with a new album, beloved French synth-pop outfit M83, who have been mostly making soundtracks, aside from one very mediocre record in terms of the last 10 years of their output. So it was really nice to see them return with a full-length studio album. I thought it was solid. Way more hits than misses on this thing. Occasionally, tracks here that I thought overstayed their welcome, drones and instrumental passages that didn't really have the sonic detail and texture to warrant taking up so much time on this record. But, ultimately, I think it's solid. There's plenty of great soundplay here. If you like M83 and their output in the 2000s, or you like Hurry Up We're Dreaming, there's certainly sounds and moments here that should work for you, and it's definitely worth your time to listen to. Two big voices in experimental and extreme metal music came together on the new collaborative Full of Hell and Primitive Man album. Now, I like this thing a good bit. It is raucous, it is pummeling, it is intense. I wish that there was maybe a little bit better use of time within these compositions, but ultimately, they set up for plenty of satisfying moments and some of the most pummeling and mind-bending metal music you've heard anywhere this year. The record is worth hearing, if nothing else, for the combination of Primitive Man's very sludgy intensity with the absolute blistering, dissonant chaos that Full of Hell brings to the table with their experimental and extreme metal textures and tendencies, and the results are just a really interesting album that doesn't really sound like anything else you're going to hear this year. On the EP side of things, we got, I guess, what you would call an engagement announcement in the form of this new EP from Rosalia and Raul Alejandro, and it's pretty good. I like, 2 of the 3 songs on here, and I like them quite a bit. It's a good blending of their styles for fans of Rosalia who may not like a whole ton of other contemporary reggaeton music. I would suggest giving this a shot because there's more of her artistic input going on here than you would anticipate, and the results are really, really fun. Go ahead and get out your pitchforks and torches, lesbians, because I was just okay on this new boygenius album, The Record. I guess I have a reputation for slighting all of these artists at one point or another, and the EP that this supergroup debuted with, aside from Phoebe Bridgers' Punisher, I can't really think of anything else from any of these artists that I've given a really, really glowing review to in the past. So, unsurprisingly, despite how much I loved some of the singles, in particular, Not Strong Enough, a great, great fucking song, I wasn't crazy about this. I thought that the track list was a little bit inconsistent. I thought that Phoebe's songwriting is visible all over this record, and it's her at her peak cringe, occasionally so cringe that it's hard to even take it anymore. It kind of started to feel like reading her Twitter feed at some point, which is the last thing I'd ever want to do. Everybody does have their moments to shine on this record, particularly Lucy Dacus, who steals the show and delivers some of the best songs that I think she has ever written and fronted as an artist within the tracklist of this record, but they all have their misses too, and there are slouches all over this album. It is an extremely mixed bag, and I'm not really sure it lives up to the hype or expectations that many publications and fans leveled onto it. And speaking of fan expectations, this new Yves Tumor album, whose title I will not read out loud, was probably my most favorite release ever from Used Humor from this project, because I just liked the singles so much. I came around a little late to the last project, didn't like it as much as a lot of people, thought that maybe it was just never going to click with me, and then hearing some of the singles from this record really, really grabbed me. I was really excited to go into this record and give it a chance, and sifting through the deep cuts on this thing just always felt like a chore. None of them are as exciting. The performances are not as engaging or interesting. I think for Used Humor, this is a step down in almost all facets, which is fine. Not every record has to be the best record ever, but for this to be the first one that I was really anticipating and really excited to get into, and for it to kind of blow up in my face like this and just be a very, very okay album, I'm not crazy about. And another album that I was super, super, super excited for after hearing the singles, so pumped for the long-awaited debut album from Gecs, and getting into this record, it was just kind of a disappointment at first, and after listen after listen after listen, I kind of realized that it was really just the first half of this record that was letting me down. The second half goes to some really interesting places, and the kind of places I was hoping Gecs would go when we inevitably got a studio album from her. It's just getting there ultimately can be a little bit of a chore, and assessing the record, it's hard to ignore just how much of the first half of it is a total snooze fest. And finally, for this section, which is starting to feel like a list of disappointments, though I didn't intend it that way, the new Unknown Mortal Orchestra album, 5, probably my least favorite project of theirs yet, because it's just too much. There's just too much going on here, too many mediocre songs. The lo-fi production is so heavy-handed occasionally in a way I didn't really even think lo-fi production could be, but God, there are deep cuts here who just beg for an energy and excitement and a clarity that the production and mixing is not providing them. Make no mistake, there are some massive highlights here, many of which were singles. Just like any Unknown Mortal Orchestra record, there is some great moments to be found, but it is amidst a full 60-minute crawl of music that does not deliver anywhere near a measure of consistency in terms of quality. And that's it for the biggest, most popular stuff. Now, it is finally time to heap praise onto some of my favorite releases of the past 2 months. Right at the start of March, I reviewed the new Shoo Shoo album, Ignore Grief, and I liked it quite a bit. It is certainly a change in style from their last true studio album, Girl with a Basket of Fruit. This album is a lot more sparse than I think a lot of people were anticipating, and while that could make it a little bit difficult for relatively new fans of Shoo Shoo to jump into this thing, I just recommend that you give it a chance, because the space that it is operating within, both in terms of time and composition, and the mixing and arrangements and the dark voids that these songs produce, they are completely enveloping and entrancing and enjoyable. I was also quite satisfied with the new Fever Ray album. I have long been a fan of The Knife. I have enjoyed some of Karen's solo music in the past, so I was really looking forward to this outing. I enjoyed some of the singles like Carbon Dioxide and Candy a lot. And what I wasn't anticipating loving so much about this album is the production from Olaf Drescher, the other member of The Knife. And while, yes, you can go into this record and get a lot of personality from Karen, ultimately it was the sound of the music and the instrumentation consistently throughout this record which just thrilled me. It's an infinitely rewarding sonic palette to explore, which I have done for almost 2 months now, and I still find these little moments, these little instrumental flourishes that I adore. This is just a great record, great listening experience, highly recommended if you like weirdo electronica or even weirdo singer-songwriter music. And I said it in ringtone, I'll say it again, despite some of the record's dumbest ambitions, I like the new 100 Gecs album quite a bit. It goes extremely hard. Singles like Doritos and Fritos, Hollywood Baby, one of my favorite songs of the year so far, the opening track, Dumbest Girl Alive. There is just so much to digest and dig through here beyond the baseline level of charming silliness in all of these songs. And while, of course, I do think that they occasionally take it a little bit too far in some of their indulgences, ultimately, I enjoy a lot more of this track list than I don't, and I think it's a fun and fitting follow-up to their debut. Lana Del Rey. Did you know that there's a tunnel under Ocean Boulevard? Liked this album quite a bit. Another long outing from Lana Del Rey that is a little bit inconsistent. I will say the Bleachers featuring song in the track list here might be my least favorite Lana song of all time. But there are also some absolutely amazing highlights in here. Lana is in her songwriter bag at a number of points, and the multi-phased A&W is easily my favorite song of the year so far, as well as a huge favorite for Song of the Year at the end of the year when that time comes. Yeah, this song has a versatility of arrangement with some bangers like Peppers and the Cool Venice Bitch mashup that show up at the end of this thing, but there are also some more reserved, more singer-songwriter flavored moments like the Grants and the title track, and it is just a highlight fest almost throughout. Aside from a little dip in quality around the middle, I can say that I really, really enjoy this record a lot. It was never a chore to listen through it all the way, even though there are moments that I'm not crazy about, and I foresee it being one of my favorite pop records of the year when all is said and done. Look away, hoes, because we have to talk about Scaring the Hose, the new collaborative experimental hip-hop project from two of the genre's most beloved underground MCs, Danny Brown and JPEG Mafia. This has been controversial, may not be the right word, but contentious among fans because the production is particularly raw, and if you're familiar with JPEG Mafia's music in the past, you will be no stranger to that. And while, yes, I did have some complaints about this record, the production was one of them. The fact that it feels so much more like a Peggy record than a Danny Brown record is another big one, and what I think really holds this record back from achieving how good it could have been, but it's still a damn solid record. The talent on display is great. The creative ambition going into both of this is just fascinating, and the results, while occasionally a little bit mixed, are mostly consistently great, exciting, unpredictable, and intense. My favorite metal album of the year so far, maybe my favorite album of the year so far, period, the epic new Liturgy project. This is just another massive outing from Liturgy that deals in these both long, winding, intense compositions as well as thoroughly detailed psychological and philosophical musings. This record just has so much to pour through. I went through so much work familiarizing myself with the concepts and the details of this album in order to review it, and through that process, I just completely fell in love with it. It is once again a Liturgy project where I find myself thrilled by the details, by the little things that are deployed all over this record. They're just rewarding experiences that made going back to the record and re-listening to it a new experience every single time. The combination of some of the absolutely ripping, raw, and even sometimes glitchy black metal moments at their most harsh on this record with some of the gospel-influenced shorter tracks and interludes, it adds this grandiosity and this epicness to the sensation of digesting the record that I kind of find irresistible. There isn't really another album that I can even think of that scratches the same itch for me as this one. And that has made returning to this thing a pretty common occurrence since I first heard it, and I suspect that that's not going to stop anytime soon. Another album I really, really like that will not surprise anyone, the new Tim Hacker project, No Highs. When Tim Hacker drops a new album, it is a big deal for fans of ambient music, and that describes me perfectly. This thing is a kind of interesting change of pace for Tim Hacker in terms of returning to the very cloudy, very ominous production and mixing style of a record like Virgins, but also just the interpolations of live instrumentation that you can find all over this thing. It is the type of listening experience that I would not compare to the previous two Tim Hecker records. It is kind of like its own new thing entirely, and in a lot of that misty haze and cloudy, ambivalent lack of detail, there are these brilliant sonic motifs that make the listening experience of processing this record extremely rewarding and very engaging, even by ambient music standards, and just enthralling, enveloping. I love losing myself in this album. And finally, shout out North Carolina's own Wednesday with their new project Rat Saw God, which has been billed as a breakout record for the band. I have been paying attention to them for quite a while now, saw a ton of the buzz going around for the group going into this record, and yeah, it mostly lives up to the hype. I'm not going to say that this is the greatest indie rock, indie folk album I've ever heard or anything, but I really appreciate its versatility and its style of songwriting. This album has its really pummeling, intense moments, particularly the Rate Your Music fan favorite Bowl Believer, but in my opinion, where it is even better is when it digs into the little details and nuances of songwriting on particularly tracks like the great single and closing track TV and the Gas Pump. I have found a lot of enjoyment with the most intimate moments on Rat Saw God. And that is it. Some albums worth checking out, some albums very much not worth checking out, and also just my thoughts on some of the most popular and most talked about releases of the past 2 months. That is it for me. I am bowing out. Thank you. I will be back soon with a new kind of video, something I've never really done before. Hopefully it is enjoyable or entertaining, or you can bully me into not doing it anymore. And then sometime after that, at the end of June, we will do what is always the most popular thing I do, recap the 20 best records of the year thus far. So I will see you there.